Спасибо конференции, что дали мне главную сцену. Наверное, вы все уже видели приходящие сегодня.
It's February 16th, 2024, and a hush descends on the Munich Security Conference as a woman, puffy-eyed and resolute, steps onto the stage. This is Yulia Navalnaya, hitherto known as the wife of jailed Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny. A short while before, phones in the conference centre had started buzzing with the news that Alexei is dead, possibly murdered in an Arctic penal colony. Yulia's decision to take to the stage that day committed her to a path from which there can be no turning back. A few days later, she released a video announcing her determination to continue her husband's work and take on the mantle of his scattered opposition organisation.
Привет, это Юлия Навальная. Сегодня в первый раз на этом канале я хочу обратиться к вам. На моем месте должен быть другой человек.
Around the world, Russian opposition activists and sympathisers welcome Yulia's message, painful though it may be to watch. Although not aligned or in any way connected to the Navalny organisation, a group called Feminist Anti-War Resistance posts in support of Yulia, saying, "It is a huge feat to turn grief into action right now without delay, without pausing to recover. They say there is nothing worse than a woman's rage. A woman's rage that springs from such a loss will be impossible to stop." Feminist anti-war resistance activist Lolia Nordic explains.
There is a lot of suppressed rage that people in Russia are having, but I think that this kind of rage, it can't be oppressed forever, and I think there is a tipping point towards it. There is a boiling point. So I think rage is also a very feminism related emotion, because we as women are taught to suppress our so-called negative emotion. We are taught to be nice and we're taught to be very submissive, and rage is something that our governments doesn't want us to experience. And I think that Yulia represents the alternative in the way that she is not a submissive person. She doesn't want to submit to the Russian oppressive laws. She doesn't want to submit to the orders that our criminal governments are giving us as Russian citizens. She is a mother and a wife who is standing in opposition towards this governmental power. So I think this is a very important thing, and this is very, I think, relatable to many other women in Russia. For example, those women who already lost their husbands in the war, who got mobilized by force. Not only husbands, but brothers and boyfriends and sons and grandsons. And there are a lot of these women who are now mobilizing with each other and collaborating with each other to stand in opposition in front of the government and saying that we want our relatives back.
Yulia Navalnaya's fierce embodiment of the role of wife, mother, and now widow are in direct defiance of the role that state propaganda is increasingly expecting women to play in Russia. It's a powerful political message which has the power to reach people, particularly women, well outside of the opposition bubble. Katya Fedorova is a Russian fashion journalist, now turned consultant, in exile. In February 2021, when Alexei Navalny was put on trial for violating the conditions of his parole, he'd been airlifted to hospital in Berlin after being poisoned with a nerve agent, she put out a call on Instagram for women to wear red, Yulia's favourite colour, in support of her. The response went around the world.
And I was so furious and feeling so powerless at the same time that I felt I had to do something. So I put on a red sweater because Julia wore red. And I wrote a post asking people to support her, because I knew that the women, especially, they feel for her, even if they're not like very politically active and things like that, just humanistically, you can't not feel for her at that moment. And of course, I didn't expect it. to get that big, I thought it'll be like me and 30 friends, but then the universe took over and basically it became like this whole worldwide thing.
This week, when Yulia Navalnaya released a second video on social media calling for Russians to register their protests during next week's presidential elections by turning up at polling stations at 12 noon to either vote against Putin or spoil their ballot, she was wearing red.
Привет, это Юлия Навальная, а это вы, самые лучшие, самые смелые, самые честные люди нашей страны. Люди, которые дарят мне надежду. Это вы в пятницу, 1 марта, стояли в многочасовой...
She gives us so much strength to me, and I'm sure to other people. I speak to a lot of friends. She gives us the motivation and the strength to try to keep fighting. And also, as a woman, for me, and like, once again, knowing how patriarchal Russia is and how few politicians that are in Russian politics who are women, not just, sitting there in the Duma and pretending to do things, but like people who change things. And she's one of them. I think it's a huge advantage that she's a woman.
Will Yulia Navalnaya's call for noon against Putin protests on election day be heeded? Yulia Nordic stresses that she cannot yet speak for her network, Feminist Anti-War Resistance.
I can say that we are watching and hearing the news from Yulia and her statements, but we are a horizontal movement, so we always need some time to make a decision. We have a specific decision-making process to involve as much participants as possible. So right now we're in a process of deciding, but I can say that right now I'm supposing that most of our activists are going to support it.
Should noon against Putin turn into significant rolling protests across Russia's 11 time zones next week, this will further cement Yulia Navalnaya's position as Russia's new unofficial opposition figurehead. That position, however, comes at a great cost.
We are very aware as Feminist Anti-War Resistance Movement, as a collective of feminist activists, that being a woman politician is a very complicated and difficult job, because you are not only facing the risks of being murdered and killed by Russian government and Russian special forces and being, in the opposition to a lot of different political forces, but you are also facing a huge wave of misogyny, of sexism, and of gender-based violence just because you are a woman in politics. And we are already seeing a wave of Russian propaganda targeting Yulia as a female, as a wife, and writing and saying and mentioning terrible things about her, very misogynistic, very sexist things about her.
Russia is a very patriarchal country. Russian propaganda and a lot of people in Russia are like criticizing her, saying that, oh, look at her husband is in jail, or now he's unfortunately dead, and she looks great. Look, she like has makeup on, she's wearing bright clothing, and they're really criticizing her for that. And I think that's also part of her response, part of like you. I don't know if I can say it, but there is no better word. I think it's also another one of her responses showing that, she doesn't care about what they say and she's going to go her way.
Russian fashion journalist and consultant Katya Fedorova there. Before that, you heard Yulia Nordic from the Feminist Anti-War Resistance group. Yulia Navalnaya's defiance is not in doubt. She may not have had time to articulate her own political platform yet, but as she showed when addressing the EU Parliament last week, her mission and her motivation could not be clearer.
Putin killed my husband, Alexei Navalny. On his orders, Alexei was tortured for 3 years. He was starved in a tiny stone cell, cut off from the outside world, and denied visits, phone calls, and then even letters. And then they killed him. Even after that, they abused his body and abused his mother. You cannot hurt Putin with another resolution or another set of sanctions. That is no different from the previous ones. You cannot defeat him by thinking he is a man of principle who has morals and rules. Alexei realized that a long time ago. You are not dealing with a politician, but with a bloody monster. Putin is the leader of an organized criminal gang. Putin must answer for what he has done with my country. Putin must answer for what he has done to a neighboring peaceful country. And Putin must answer for everything he has done to Alexei.
Yulia Navalnaya, in her own words there, a voice demanding to be heard. Now, Russia's war with Ukraine has made it clearer than ever that security in Europe is not something that can be taken for granted. Still, many European countries continue to have problems enlisting enough recruits to fill the ranks of their militaries. Increasingly, recruiters are realising that part of the problem is that they are failing to make an army career path attractive to half their population, women. For this International Women's Day special, Terry Schultz took flight with a special crew from Geilenkirchen's NATO airbase in northwest Germany to find out whether change might be in the air.
NATO's first ever all-woman crew on an AWACS flight is keeping its eyes on the alliance's eastern flank.
We are flying right now over Poland. Our mission is to monitor and do surveillance.
But this flight had other missions too, to demonstrate that women can do the same jobs as men in the military, to address gaps in gender equality, and to highlight role models. It was organized by the Women's Initiative team created a year ago at Germany's Geilenkirchen Air Base. Here's one of the co-founders, U.S. Air Force Captain Beatrice, who's asked us to use only her first name.
We are looking for the next generation to follow in our flight suits. So I am really hoping to address the 10-year-old girl somewhere who sees that this is an initiative that NATO promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion and wants to potentially come here and fly as well.
But speaking of their flight suits, this is an example of one of the inequities Captain Beatrice says many female flyers run into. They're often issued men's uniforms, which don't fit them properly because there's not a sufficient supply of women's gear.
There's a gap here where we don't have female flight suits nor maternity flight suits, which isn't something that is talked about a lot, but there's still a need for it because women do get pregnant, right? And we need to make sure that we have, for our safety reasons on the aircraft, still fitting flying equipment.
So that makes women uncomfortable in one way, but there are other ways too, like discrimination in career advancement and sexual harassment. Canadian Lieutenant Colonel Melissa, who also didn't want to give her last name, says she and other Canadians have been encouraged to speak out publicly on past problems and what's being done to fix them. One of those things is removing the gender designation from annual evaluation forms so it's less of a factor in promotions.
In the past, we weren't doing a good job. We've been empowered to talk about it, to identify the issues that we had in the past so that we can move on with them. Because I think too often we just want to hide the problems and we say it's not a problem, but it really was a problem with sexual misconduct, for example. So these initiatives attack those issues that we had and make sure that there's gender equality and support for diversity for everybody.
Celebrating milestones like this flight helps morale, but so do the steps that make everyday life easier, like the Women's Initiative team's success over the last year in establishing the first mother's rooms for breastfeeding or pumping at the Geilenkirchen base, proudly displayed by U.S. Air Force Master Sergeant Langius.
Before that, people had to be at their desks or go in the back office or just look around.
Actually, some of the mothers, they have to do breast pumping or breastfeeding, nursing in their cars. So that was unsafe environment for them. So now we have one that is safe, secure, and sound for them. So this is a big accomplishment.
Now that the war in Ukraine has put a spotlight on military's difficulties in reaching recruitment goals, making that an attractive career for women is getting more attention. That's something Irene Feline is always looking at. She's NATO's special representative for women, peace, and security.
We are recognizing that there is this untapped potential.
Feline is tasked with incorporating gender perspectives into all alliance work. She says responsibility for this goes far beyond the military and starts with education.
If we want collectively to promote and advance gender equality, which is for NATO an important value, is a reflection of our core values, we need to do this collectively across all the areas of work. And education is key on that. Education outside and within the military.
There's a lot of room for improvement. Across NATO countries, the average participation of women in the military is 13%, according to 2020 statistics, the latest available. That ranges from almost 20% in Hungary to 0.3% in Turkey. But Irene Feline notes it's moving in the right direction. 20 years ago, she says, the average was just 6%. But at this rate, it will be many decades before an all-woman flight crew could be a NATO norm. Terry Schultz, DW, Brussels.
For all the latest European security news, as well as insights from within the Brussels bubble, you can follow Terry Schultz on Mastodon and X. I'm Kate Laycock in Germany. You're listening to Inside Europe. Supporters of abortion rights are celebrating this week in France after the country became the first in the world to enshrine the freedom to have the procedure in its constitution. For feminist Annie Chemla, who joined the movement to legalise abortion half a century ago and has recently published a book about her experience, it was an especially sweet victory. Lisa Bryant reports from the Paris suburb of Sannois.
Je m'appelle Annie Chemla. Je vis en banlieue parisienne et je viens d'écrire un livre qui raconte...
A photo of Annie Chemla's two daughters is perched on the bookshelf of her sitting room. She's never had an abortion, but she spent the 1970s fighting for those who did.
Bien, jusque-là, l'avortement était illégal en France.
Abortion was illegal in France. Many women were helped by other women to perform very dangerous abortions with knitting needles, or others paid a lot to doctors to perform one, or went to the Netherlands or Britain because it was legal in those countries.
Chemla holds up her newly published book, Nous l'avons fait, or We Did It, recounting her experience as an activist in the abortion rights movement.
Mouraient par an d'avortement en France.
At the time, she says, an average of 300 women died yearly from botched abortions. In the hospitals that performed them illegally, doctors used an extremely painful procedure, sometimes with no anesthetic.
The intention was to punish women who had abortions so they wouldn't do so again.
Viens aujourd'hui à cette tribune, ministre de la Santé, femme et non parlementaire.
Abortion was legalized in 1975 in France in what is known as the Veil Act, after French health minister and Holocaust survivor Simone Veil. In 2018, Veil became only one of a handful of women to be buried at France's celebrated Pantheon, one of the highest honors. But behind her law, Chemla says, were many unknown activists pushing to make it happen.
We had stands in the markets with tea towels on which we wrote our slogans, a child when I want, if I want one. And we don't beg for our bodies, we fight for them. We really fought, and French society was behind us because it didn't tolerate having women die from abortions.
Chemla was recently divorced when she joined the abortion rights movement. A few years earlier, she had moved to France from her native Tunisia.
Après l'indépendance, les lois étaient extrêmement...
After Tunisia's independence, laws were very liberal. I could get contraceptives easily. Abortions were legal and easy. When I arrived in France, I discovered that the country, considered to champion liberty and human rights, was very late on this. It made me want to fight to ensure French women had at least as many rights as Tunisian ones did.
Abortion rights haven't been seriously challenged in recent years in this once staunchly Catholic nation. But France has been looking across the Atlantic at the United States, where the Supreme Court overturned a half-century-old decision guaranteeing abortion rights, commonly known as Roe v. Wade. Since then, some U.S. states have largely banned or curtailed abortions. Last year, French President Emmanuel Macron pledged to include abortion rights in the Constitution. The final version was softened, guaranteeing instead the freedom to abort.
Nombre de votants, 902. Nombre de suffrages exprimés, 852. Majorité requise.
On Monday, French deputies and senators adopted the legislation at a special session at Versailles Palace, after previous votes in the two chambers.
S'il n'y avait pas eu cet arrêt de la Cour suprême.
If there hadn't been this rollback by the U.S. Supreme Court, I think we wouldn't have talked about constitutionalizing abortion in France. It's to protect a right that we believe in a lot.
The Vatican has criticized the move. Anti-abortion activists like Caroline Roux, deputy general director of a nonprofit called Alliance Vita, warn it's a dangerous step.
Nous pensons que ça pose une question de rapport entre les droits.
The law legalizing abortion clashes with other liberties, the right to life, the right to the clause of conscience, the right to free expression. We think there must be other options than abortions.
Even today, Shemla worries abortion rights could be rolled back.
Et on a bien vu aux USA qu'il suffit d'un changement.
We saw in the U.S. that it just needs a change in the political majority to have a law we thought was a given for decades be repealed.
The fight for her and for others on both sides of the abortion debate isn't over. Lisa Bryant, DW, Sanois, France.
And the legal struggles continue in our Spotify quiz this week as well. Unbelievably, there is one European country where women did not have the right to vote until 1984. We want to know which one you think it is. Head over to Spotify to take part in the poll. Inside Europe is, of course, available on all the other usual platforms, including YouTube, via the DW Podcasts channel. This is Inside Europe, and I'm Kate Laycock in Germany.